Do not underestimate the element of surprise. Today I'm going to discuss 3 decks that are going to give you a huge edge because the metagame is not prepared for them. Hey everyone, this is Nikachu, Merfolk Master, and do you ever remember the very first time you ever play against an archetype and how many mistakes you've made against them because A, you don't know exactly what's in their deck so you can't play around anything and you walk into every single blowout, or you haven't accumulated any experience against the deck. You don't know the optimal strategy in order to beat them because you have not put in the reps against those archetypes. Well, why don't you play it from the other side and get an advantage from the fact that your opponent has no experience with your deck? And that's what I'm going to go over today. My top 3 picks for archetypes that right now get that extra edge, get that advantage, because the metagame as a whole, the modern community, isn't accustomed to playing against these decks. But before we get into it, I would love to thank our sponsor, Mana Traders. Mana Traders is the premier place to go rent Magic the Gathering online cards. You can support the channel by using my link in the description below, or you can get 20% off your first 3 months by using my coupon code Nikachu. So the first deck I'm going to go over has already made a name for itself. However, I don't think enough decks have yet put in the reps against the archetype, and that is mono white tokens. Now, this archetype is doing pretty well by itself in the metagame because it is so good at grinding out other value-based decks. I mean, good luck, Jund. Jund tries to water your deck down with 1-for-1 removal spells until you have nothing left, but that is very difficult to do against a deck like tokens where every 1 mana spent is representing at least 1 threat. You know, you spend 2 mana on Gather the Townsfolk, get 2 creatures. Spend 2 mana on Raise the Alarm, get 2 creatures. Spend 3 mana on Spectral Procession, get 3 creatures. Good luck, Liliana the Veil! So this archetype does have a lot of game in today's metagames, gone deep in a lot of events, and also has made quite a few 5-0s. But I think the value out of this archetype is that people are not really accustomed to what's in it. Until you've actually faced a Raise the Alarm, you absolutely have no idea that it's coming. And, you know, if it's just putting 2 white 1/1 soldier creature tokens onto the battlefield at flash speed, that can exchange itself with a lot of creatures, but if there's an intangible virtue on the battlefield, if there's a force of virtue, that's going to be card advantage. Just a 2/2 creature might block and trade with a creature, and you get to keep the other 2/2. So, the deck is not to be underestimated, and so I've heard that it's a very fun deck to play, and it's very explosive. You can very easily get a Venerated Loxodon on the battlefield by turn 3, turning all your 1/1s into 2/2s, not to mention that the 4/4 Venerated Loxodon is pretty good by itself, out of range of Lightning Bolt, out of range of Fatal Push because it actually technically costs 5 mana, and also is on the same strength and power level as something like Thoughtseize, also being a 4/4 creature. So it can stand, it can go toe-to-toe with the other very larger creatures of Modern, but it still has a lot of interaction between Path to Exile and Dismember for any creature-based matchups. Not to mention, it's got other interaction like Giant Killer, destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. Fantastic against those Thought-Knot Seers, those Tarmogoyfs, those Reality Smashers. And also, just by itself, it can tap down very large creatures, so it is good in that right. Legion's Landing, 1 mana, 1/1, create a white vampire with lifelink, but you can also grind out control decks because of the land, Adanto, the First Fort. So you actually have a lot of game against the aggro decks, against the attrition-based decks, against the control decks. And this is most definitely a deck that is going to induce a lot of mistakes from your opponents. They might bring in Plague Engineer thinking, oh, they got the game, oh, it's all easy, just bring in Plague Engineer and it's over. Well, okay, there are so many different creature types in this deck. We've got Vampire, we've got Spirit, we've got Servos, we've got Soldiers, we've got Humans. So, you know, Plague Engineer is not the end of the world. Not to mention, you know, your opponent could play Eidolon of the Great Revel thinking the game is over, but Spectral Procession actually technically costs 6 mana. Freely play your Spectral Processions in the face of an Eidolon of the Great Revel. So this deck Not to mention, if people are not playing around Force of Virtue, can also get completely blown out because they might assume the math one way, but then at instant speed you play the Force of Virtue and you have a Lord on the battlefield. So there's a lot of ways of going wrong against this archetype. If you've never faced a Force of Virtue before, you can go get completely blown out. If you've never faced a Raise of the Alarm, you can get completely blown out. If you don't respect the tokens on the battlefield and how it can ramp out a Venerated Loxodon, you can also get blown out. So I think this deck is not only pretty good right now, but you get an extra edge because people do not know how, or do not have a good plan against it in today's modern metagame. Now the next deck I think you have a lot of surprise value with is Blue-White Tempo. Now this is basically a control deck, but much heavier on creatures. So on turn 0, your opponent's going to see that you're playing with Yorion Sky Nomad, but this is not the Yorion deck you once knew. This archetype is very similar to Blue-White Tempo decks of the past, running things like Kitchen Finks, Vendilion Click, Restoration Angel, and these archetypes, they come up and then they go away. They don't seem to last forever, and they usually just turn into blue-white control decks, but occasionally when it's well positioned, it has a lot of surprise value because you have no idea how to play against a deck with Kitchen Finks in it. It is very, very difficult when this control deck plays Kitchen Finks, attacks. You might think, well, the coast is clear, I'm just going to attack myself, but then they play Restoration Angel, blink Kitchen Finks. Kitchen Finks comes onto the battlefield again, they gain 2 life, now they have 2 blockers, and they completely blow you out. So if you're not accustomed to this sort of deck, and you just sort of think that this is a control deck, well, you're going to be completely dead wrong. Also, they could start off with something like Wall of Omens, play land drops, Teferi Time Reveler, and you might be taking your time, and taking, you might be pacing yourself because you think you're up against a control deck, but then all of a sudden they start throwing out creatures at end of turn. They start throwing out the Vendilion Click into the Restoration Angel, into the Brazen Bar, and the Kitchen Finks, and you realize you don't have nearly as much time as you thought that you did, and you're under a lot of pressure, and by the time you realize that, it's all over. It's too late. You're gonna get completely stomped, and it's very difficult if you have never played against this type of or style of deck before, because we are so accustomed to playing against, the Stoneblade decks or the Blue-Eye Control decks. This is a very different breed. It's very hard. It's harder to calculate your clock because of Kitchen Finks and the rate that it can get blinked, either by Restoration Angel or Yorion itself. Yeah, it's just tough. It's a deck that forces you to commit more resources to the board, way more than usual because of Wall of Omens to be able to attack through, and also the Kitchen Finks. But then they can still slam you with Supreme Verdict, and like, what do you care? What do you care about playing Supreme Verdict in this deck? Because you already drew your card off of Wall of Omens, and you're gonna get your Kitchen Finks back. It has Persist. So Kitchen Finks dies, but then comes back, you gain 2 life, and don't forget, you can still blank it all over again, and you reset the Kitchen Finks back to where it used to be. So this is an archetype very, very difficult to play against if you've never played against it before. It's definitely a little bit more, it's an 80 card deck now because we're playing with Yorion, and Yorion is a perfect card in this style of deck because there are so many good things that you can blink between Snapcaster Mage, Wall of Omens, Kitchen Finks, Vendilion Click, Restoration Angel, Teferi Time Raveler, and Jace the Mind Sculptor. So I think you're going to get a lot of free wins. You're going to get a lot of free wins from your opponent just attacking into an empty board, and you just Restoration Angel them, block the last thing, and because you already had perfect information because of one of your Vendilion Clicks or something like that. But even on an empty board, you can end up getting blown out by a Restoration Angel. If you do not see the Restoration Angel coming, you are absolutely going to get destroyed by this thing, because it's so easy to assume you're just a random blue-white deck. I mean, if your opponent goes like Hollowed Fountain into Flooded Strand, into like Mystic Sanctuary, why would you think anything differently? You need to get a clue somewhere else to assume that this is some other deck. You see cards like Spell Snare, Path to Exile Opt, So it's very difficult to figure out when you're actually a blue-white tempo deck, not a blue-white full-on blue-white control deck, but at that point it could be too late. So I think this is a deck that has a lot of good surprise value right now in today's modern metagame. And the last deck I think you can get a really big edge with in today's metagame is 5-color elementals. This is just a really good tier deck that has not caught enough attention, and I think you can quietly win a lot of games with this archetype. This is a deck that will just absolutely crush the opponents with 2 cards. First, Lightning Skelemental. Red, red, black, trample, haste. It deals damage to the opponent. They have to discard 2 cards. That is crazy value. And not to mention, you know what, the Lightning Skelemental you would think is going to go away, but no, it's not going to go away. It's going to come back with Thunderkin Awakener. Haste, whenever it attacks, choose target elemental card in your graveyard with toughness less than Thunderkin Awakener's toughness. You know, the Lightning Skelemental has 1 toughness, so it's going to come back. And return that card to the battlefield tapped and attacking, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This is piles of damage, piles of card advantage that you can get with Thunderkin Awakener, and of course, you can just tutor for all of this stuff with Flamekin Harbinger. 1 red, 1/1 creature. You search your library and you put a card on top. You just put an elemental card on top. The Goblins deck wishes it had a card like this. We already see the Goblins deck playing with Bogart Harbinger with Conspicuous Snoop. This is a superior Bogart Harbinger. It's just for 1 mana. So mana efficient, it can come into play immediately with Ether Vial. With 1 counter on it, so it's coming down very early for you to set up your bigger turns. And the second creature that I think puts this deck way over the top is Risen Reef. So Risen Reef, blue, green, 1 generic. Whenever Risen Reef or another elemental enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you can put it on the battlefield tapped. If you don't put the card onto the battlefield, put it into your hand. That's super card advantage. It's like, you know how you like sometimes scry a land to the bottom? You scry lands into play. That's basically what this is. Oh, this is a land. Well, I don't need that land, but I'm going to put it onto the battlefield. And then you combine it with all the other elementals that you have in this deck. You know, you attack with your Thunderkin Awakener to put Lightning Skelemental onto the battlefield. Trigger it twice. You know, triggers. Keep the gas coming. Vial these things in play. So, a lot of value here. Incredible. You can play with Unsettled Mariner, which is a shapeshifter tech. Not exactly an elemental, but it will work. That's what a shapeshifter is. It's every creature type, and Unsettled Mariner will protect your board from instants and sorceries. Not to mention, a really good card in this deck, which I think is going to catch some people off guard, is Voice of Resurgence. Voice of Resurgence. Whenever an opponent casts a spell during your turn, or when Voice of Resurgence dies, create a green and white elemental creature token with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control. Now, let me tell you, if you haven't played against Voice of Resurgence in a long time, a lot of people are going to be making the mistake of casting spells on your turn. Voice of Resurgence should be protecting your turn, but without a doubt, if you haven't played against Voice of Resurgence in a long time, you're going to make the mistake of casting spells directly into it. That's one thing. Like, if you haven't played against this card in a long time, you end up walking into it, and your opponent's going to be making giant elementals. And even if they don't blunder like that, even if they don't punt, this card is still going to protect you on your turn, or if it ever dies from your opponent's removal, it's a great card to grind because it leaves a body on the battlefield afterwards. Not to mention there are so many good tutor targets for the Flamekin Harbinger. You can find Smoke Braider, but you can most importantly find Flicker Wisp, Fulminator Mage. You can find Incandescent Soul Stoke. You can find Vesperlark. Omnath, Locus of the Royal, Shriekmaw, Spite Bellows. So this is a deck that if the opponent has no clue what is the toolbox, if they don't know what is coming, if they tap out at the wrong moment, they're going to get screwed. They could end up tapping out thinking, oh, nothing bad could happen next turn. Boom! Lightning Skelemental. You should have kept up some mana for removal. You should have done it. You didn't do it. You got screwed by the Lightning Skelemental. And so, I mean, it is definitely a deck that I think is very, very strong if your opponent already knows what this deck is all about, but is also much stronger because the opponent does not know exactly what's going to go on. So like if you haven't accumulated enough experience against the elementals deck, you can end up just getting completely wrecked by it. Not to mention, I think it's really cool that this deck doesn't completely fold to a Blood Moon. There's a lot of cards that are just red in general. You know, the Smoke Braids, the Thunderkin Awakener, the Fulminator Mage, the Incandescent Soul Stoke, the Spiked Bellows, and also you've got 4 Ether Vial, so you're covered there, even though it is a 5-color archetype. I think 5-color elementals is probably the deck that will get you the best surprise value in the modern metagame today. So those are my recommendations for decks that are going to catch all your opponents off guard. If you have any other ones, I would love to know about them in the description below. If you want to play any of these decks, I've got links to deck list in the description. And also, I'm a streamer. If you would like to come and hang out on my stream, talk about stuff like this, go check out the description below for my stream schedule. One more shout out to my sponsor, Mana Traders, where you can rent and try out decks like this on Magic the Gathering Online. So this has been Nikachu, Merfolk Master, talking about the decks that will give you a surprise edge in the modern metagame.